I did, no, I think I did call twice, yeah, that was good. It was like 508. Okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. We have a busy meeting ahead of us today with this committee considering H.R. 823, H.R. 1373, and H.R. 2181 from the Natural Resources Committee. These bills are designed to protect some of the most irreplaceable landscapes in our country, public lands that belong to all Americans, not the highest bidder. We're also considering H.Res. 296 from the Foreign Affairs Committee. This measure is an opportunity for the House to speak loudly and about the Armenian genocide and finally acknowledge what it actually was, a genocide. Although the executive branch has issued proclamations and Congress has passed measures over the years on this, none in modern times have actually relayed all the facts and called it what it really was. Enough with the euphemisms. Facts are important. Speaking the truth is important. And if dark chapters in our history are not acknowledged, they are doomed to be repeated. Armenian Americans have brought so much richness to our communities, not just by their contributions to the social and economic well-being of our nation, but also to its soul. They were among the first to recognize and defend the truth of the Holocaust. And when genocide was taking place in Darfur, Sudan, Armenian Americans were on the front lines calling for action by Congress and the White House. And still, nearly 100 years later, America has not formally recognized the genocide perpetrated against them, which cost 1.5 million Armenians their lives. That lack of acknowledgement has been a black mark on our human rights record. This resolution is our chance to finally change that. All I can say is that it's about time. With that, let me turn this over to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We have a fairly packed hearing before us tonight, as you referenced, and we'll be considering 4 bills in all. I'll turn to our 3 natural resources bills first. In some form or another, all 3 bills effectively do the same thing. They set aside and designate federal lands in Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico for permanent federal protection. That means that these lands cannot be developed or mined even when important natural resources are present. I'm a co-sponsor of one of these bills, H.R. 2181, which protects lands that were the home of the Chicoan people and their descendants. But Republicans on the Natural Resources Committee have significant concerns about these bills. In the cases of H.R. 1373 and H.R. 823, the bills are opposed by the member of Congress who represents the district where the protected lands are located. We should hear the concerns of opponents of all 3 of these bills, and we should make as many amendments in order as possible to ensure that all members have an opportunity to make their voices heard. We are also considering a foreign relations bill discussing the Armenian genocide. Given the numerous pressing issues the House needs to be tackling, at this time, this is clearly an important question, but I question whether the bill is the best use of the precious time at this juncture in the session. Considering everything that we have to deal with, after today, we have just 11 legislative days left to pass appropriations bills to fund the government and keep it open. There are several reauthorization deadlines coupled with our current continuing resolution, such as the special diabetes program, flood insurance, and the community health centers. These all must be addressed in the next 11 legislative days. Beyond that, we have many other pressing matters Congress must address. We should be spending our time working to lower prescription drug prices, to pass the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, to pass an infrastructure bill, to secure our border, to fix our broken immigration system, and to continue the fight against the opioid epidemic. Moreover, we still have not passed the National Defense Authorization Act nor funded our troops for this fiscal year. Addressing all of these serious matters would be a much better use of our time than what we're considering today. On top of this, I have serious concerns about the process that brought us to considering this piece of legislation from the Foreign Affairs Committee. Neither a legislative hearing nor a markup were held on this resolution. The process before us today is a far cry from regular order. I hope that when we return from our upcoming district work period, that we will take the necessary steps toward tackling these problems by following regular order. In particular, I hope that we will act quickly to pass an appropriations package to keep the government open and pass the NDAA to ensure our national defense is adequately funded and supported. And once these are done, I hope the House will turn to the long list of pressing issues I've mentioned. The American people expect no less of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I agree with you. We want to get the appropriations bills done. 96% of the federal government has been funded by the work we have already done in the House. We're waiting for the Senate. So if you have any pull over there, you might tell the Senate Majority Leader to get moving so we can actually get something done. And I know the NDA bill is in conference, and I think they're making some progress on that. But I have to tell you, I feel very strongly that the Congress should act on the Armenian genocide resolution. I think the idea that the United States has refused to acknowledge that terrible tragedy is a stain on a human rights record. And by the way, Mr. Engel not only supports it, my understanding is that Mr. McCall, the ranking Republican, does as well. And Mr. Smith, who's also on that Foreign Affairs Committee, supports it as well. So I don't think in the Foreign Affairs Committee this is controversial, and I don't think it should be controversial for the United States Congress to go on record as acknowledging a terrible atrocity that where over 1.5 million people were murdered. So having said that, thank you for your comments. I'd like to welcome our witnesses from Natural Resources Committee to provide testimony on H.R. 823, the CORE Act, H.R. 1373, the Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act, H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act. Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Bishop, we are delighted that you are here and that you brought a writing will without objection be entered into the record. And I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Chairman Grijalva.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and the members of the Rules Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today in support of 3 bills reported out of the Committee on Natural Resources. First one is H.R. 823, the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act, introduced by Natural Resources Committee member Mr. Neguse of Colorado. H.R. 1373, the Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act, a bill I have introduced along with original co-sponsor Mr. O'Halloran from Arizona, Congressman from Arizona, who, by the way, in terms of the issue that was brought up, Mr. O'Halloran's district contains much of this designation. He's a co-sponsor and a very active supporter of the legislation. H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Protection Act, introduced by Assistant Speaker Lujan of New Mexico and the Chairperson of Public Lands from New Mexico, Deb Holland. All 3 of these proposals are broadly supported. They're balanced efforts to protect locally and nationally significant public lands. In recent years, we have seen an increase in energy extraction on our public lands, particularly under the current administration's energy dominance agenda. As the footprint of these activities increases, it is more important than ever that we work to protect exceptional landscapes from the impacts of mining and drilling. There are some places that are just too precious to exploit. Each of these 3 bills would protect clean water, protect historical and cultural heritage, and protect access and use on public lands that belong to all Americans. H.R. 823, known as the CORE Act, will ensure that current and future generations can continue to hunt, fish, ski, and hike on our public lands, supporting good jobs and local economies. The CORE Act has been a decade in the making and provides a balanced approach to protect approximately 400,000 acres of public land in Colorado. This bill includes provisions to ensure that water rights are protected, to allow necessary management activities to address fire, insect infestation, and disease, and to protect high-altitude military flight training. H.R. 1373 is a culmination of well over a decade of efforts to protect the Grand Canyon and the clean waters of the Colorado River, Colorado watershed from the toxic impacts of uranium mining. This proposal would permanently extend an existing mineral withdrawal in public lands around the Grand Canyon. This moratorium was put in place after more than a 2-year study of uranium impacts in the region. Uranium mining continues to pose a threat to clean water, to a healthy environment, and to the tribal communities who relied on the Grand Canyon for thousands of years. It is important that Congress act to permanently protect the landscape because this current administration has led multiple efforts and continues to press increased efforts to remove current protections to benefit a small handful of mining industries. We shouldn't need to keep rehashing this argument over and over again. I think this legislation directs that the time is to protect the Grand Canyon is now. H.R. 2181 would codify a 10-mile buffer zone around the Chaco Cultural National Historic Park to protect ancestral Pueblo sites from the impacts of oil and gas extraction. These resources tell the story of an ancient culture, and the region surrounding the park is full of yet undiscovered cultural resources. The proposed buffer zone will limit encroaching extraction around the site in a region where 90% of the public land is already open to drilling. This is a balanced approach to protect important cultural resources. It is supported by the leadership of the Pueblos and tribes in the region and the entire New Mexico delegation. Mr. Chairman, these three bills each have broad coalitions, including significant delegation support from tribal communities, local governments, businesses, outdoor recreation groups, the environmental community, and local residents. America wants to see the public lands protected. As members of Congress, we often have to balance competing priorities, but some places, from the Grand Canyon to the ancient structures of Chaco Canyon to the beautiful lands of Colorado, they have values that go beyond what can be pulled from a well or an open pit. I ask your support in protecting these public lands, these exceptional landscapes. Again, thank you for your time and for the courtesy, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Happy now to recognize the gentleman from Utah, the ranking member, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Once again, I'm happy to be here. Too bad you've already made up your mind on what the amendments will be, but I'm still happy to be here talking to you about this stuff. Last month, I was here when you passed 3 bills to try and stop energy development, and you passed some really great amendments out at that time. My favorite one was the one you sent out to the floor to have the Department of Interior not do what they are not doing. Oh, I'm sorry, to do what they already have been doing. Cut a lot of trees down to do it. Of course, we didn't call for a vote on that because it was just a nothing amendment. So I hope you don't do that same kind of amendments on these 3 retread bills that we have here today. I can at least hope for that. The 3 retreads, this is kind of like, to keep in the Halloween spirit, this is like the candy corn of legislation. No one likes it, but it keeps getting forced on you. These 3 bills have been here before, we've gone through them before, they've been defeated before, and hopefully, if the good Lord is willing, they'll be defeated again. The one in Colorado, and here's where you have to help us out, 30% of that bill is in Mr. Tipton's district. He did not know anything about this until the bill was actually dropped. There have been statements made that they've checked all the boxes of the stakeholders, they've checked all the boxes of the military, they haven't been checked. Somebody needs to do it because I think this bill is salvageable, but it would be nice if somebody from Colorado to try and get the people together to actually do what they said they were going to do ahead of time. The one in New Mexico is a mineral withdrawal on public lands, but you have to realize everywhere that is withdrawn, there is private mineral rights holdings that have a value to it. And as soon as you withdraw the mineral rights in the surrounding federal lands, you diminish the value of those rights. Many of those rights are actually held by the Navajo Reservation. There will be 20,000 Navajo members who are impacted by this particular bill. The Navajos now are getting $96 million a year from the royalties from this process. And yet at no time has anyone ever tried to figure out what will be the impact on those people. Mr. Gosar has an amendment that asks you to withhold the implementation of this until you can actually do that study to find out what the impact may be. I know the people who live there have concerns about it because 2 of the chapters on the Navajo Reservation have passed resolutions opposed to this. That's 6,000 members who live by it, simply because the impact is unclear about what it will be. But if you go ahead and pass it, you'll make a senator happy. And if your goal is to make senators happy, then this is the bill to do it. Congratulations. Mr. Gahalva's bill wins the jackpot. This time, the last time that this bill was brought before Congress, the best evidence they had was an opinion from a Las Vegas newspaper. Unfortunately, the science is still not there. In fact, the only science that's been done has been done by the state of Arizona. And in their science on what is the impact from uranium in this particular area, basically refuted all of the allegations brought forth by the special interest groups who wanted this legislation in the first place. So simply, if you want science, if you say you want to believe in good science and use good science, if you vote for this, you're going to have a difficult time, because this is actually taking the middle finger and sticking in the face of science, because the science is there saying, nah, this is not a problem. No, this does not exist. And that's what the state of Arizona's the scientists actually came up with. Once again, 30% of this bill happens to be Mr. Gosar's district, who is opposed to it. That's the majority. That's the biggest shareholder of that particular area. But that's beside the point. The bottom line is we already need uranium to meet our military as well as lifestyle needs. 97% of the uranium the United States uses is imported from 4 countries. The bulk of that is coming from 4 places. 3 countries that used to be part of the USSR, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Russia. And the Chinese who need uranium have actually been bringing theirs in from Africa. But the cool part about that is those mines are all owned by the Chinese. So if you actually are trying to drive another nail in the coffin of American uranium development, which is the goal of this particular piece of legislation, to satisfy the special interest groups that want that, well, that once again just demands that you're going to have to rely on foreign sources of people who are not necessarily friendly to us from the supply of what we need for military defense in the future. I think those are some of the reasons why these bills were not passed before. Hopefully there'll be some of the reasons why these bills won't pass over in the Senate again or be signed, but in the meantime, we can have a lot of fun talking about stuff for special interest groups. Now, I'm going to do something I have never asked before from this committee. I'm actually going to ask for an open rule. You know I don't like open rules because it defeats the committee process. But in this situation, in our committee, we are still doing rolled votes. You're going to be ready for this one, aren't you? Which is the process I hate in any body in which it does it. It simply means no one is there to hear what all the debate is. So, for example, when this was heard in our committee, when it was debated in our committee, 9 of the 46 members were actually there to listen to it. When the hearings were there were even fewer members there to hear any of the testimony about the bill. When we actually have the rolled votes, everyone shows up to vote the way they are told or not told to do. But actually understanding the basis of these bills didn't happen in the committee process. Now, unfortunately, since we roll votes on the House floor, I have a tendency of being skeptical of whether it's going to be heard on the House floor, because you know how many people are on the House floor to hear debates as well. But at some point, somebody should be able to debate these issues in a place where members, not staff, but members are actually there to listen to it. It will ennoble our process if we quit rolling votes so that members actually showed up to take part in the process and actually knew what the hell they were doing.
You done?
I'm not even close to being done, but the anger level has reached a point where I now have to take a breath.
Okay, good. Just one question, Mrs. Grijalva. Do we have enough uranium supplied to our allies?
Yeah,
will a ban on uranium mining in the land surrounding the Grand Canyon pose any risk to our national security?
No, we don't need to mine around the Grand Canyon to protect our national security. The region that we're talking about in this withdrawal contains less than 1% of known U.S. Uranium reserves. For more than 3 decades, the United States successfully met its uranium needs in the global market, importing uranium from 14 countries, with the majority coming from, at this point, close allies like Canada and Australia. And the Department of Defense has indicated there's enough uranium to meet military needs for decades to come. We don't mine, and we also, mining is not we don't mine here because our uranium is found at lower concentrations in the withdrawal area. It's more expensive to produce than in other countries, and the uranium withdrawal here is among the most expensive, in the withdrawal, the most expensive even within the United States. So no, that the linchpin for national security is the ability to get uranium out from around the Grand Canyon is a falsehood. And as we get further into the debate tomorrow, the facts that I just said, plus additional facts will come that this is it's a red herring. The issue is trying to tie national security to the very vital protection. And we should note there's a bigger threat to the region. 40 million people. The 5 states that depend on the Colorado River. We had to do a conservation plan for water in the area that the Congress passed because of the need to conserve the Colorado River for the long term. And there's still a plan to come in 6 years to make some permanent changes to allocations, allotments of water, and how it's used in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and parts of California. And so that is a threat, and not to protect the watershed from any potential contamination into the Colorado River would be a huge mistake. And we feel that the permanency of this withdrawal is important because of the imminent threat that's being talked about in terms of accessing and opening up that whole region for mining that has been coming consistently from the administration in the past and currently in the efforts of the working group that is advising the president on mining and the wish list being the Grand Canyon and uranium mining around there.
Thank you. Ms. Torres. Mr. Cole.
Just a couple of quick questions, Mr. Chairman. Two of my favorite members here, worked with you both on a variety of things over the years. Chairman Halva, roughly 65% of the lands affected by H.R. 823 are in Congressman Tipton's district. I see he's here, so he probably is here to testify on this matter. I'll be looking forward to what he has to say. But as I recall, I've read something that he didn't know about this until literally he read about it. So was there any effort made to consult with members of Congress impacted by this policy?
Well, the sponsor of the legislation, a committee member, Mr. Neguse, I think worked diligently to communicate to all. You know, this piece of legislation, Senator Bennett has a companion legislation, and the bill is supported by the Colorado governor, Polis. Among Colorado, 65% prefer Congress emphasize protecting clean air and clean water and wildlife, and 90% believe that the outdoor recreation economy is important for the future of their state. And so in response to your question, the best I can is that is a prevailing opinion in Colorado, and I think this bill is reflective of that opinion.
Well, I'll find out from Mr. Tipton, but it would concern me. I just want to state for the record that when we're talking about something this large, not talking to the member that actually represents this portion of it, I think is a more than regrettable oversight. And I understand the same thing is true, a smaller percentage, though, of land, Mr. Gosar's district. Do you know if he supports this legislation? And this would have been H.R. 1373, Mr. Chairman.
He's hinted that he's opposed to it, but yes, he's very much opposed to this piece of legislation.
Okay.
But as I indicated in my opening comments, Representative Halloran, whose district contains much of this designation, is a co-sponsor and a supporter of the legislation, the original co-sponsor. So we have two people that have some responsibility for representation there in that area, both on different sides, and the majority of the withdrawal area is in Mr. O'Halloran.
I respect that, but when I think you're talking about areas this large, we sort of owe it to the members that represent those areas to have an opportunity to testify and make their views known. And honestly, that's really better done in the committee than it is done here in the Rules Committee. We're not the committee of original jurisdiction. Ranking Member Bishop, if I understand your testimony, now that you're cooled down, had a chance to catch your breath a little bit, the majority evidently had no interest in seeking Republican input on these bills, or anything other than partisan messaging bills, given that? Or?
Look, I can't see into the heart of the members that actually sponsor the bills. The bottom line is, if you're actually trying to check the box, they didn't really check the boxes. And as I said before, these are retreads. Didn't check the box the first time. It's kind of like, and you can play around with the statistics. The question that Mr. McGovern asked Mr. Grijalvas is a cute question, but it doesn't change the fact that we get the majority of our uranium from countries that aren't nice to us, not from Canada and the other places. And this is 1 million acres in which you would take away uranium, which is not only significant for the uranium byproduct itself, but also for the milling that you have in the western areas to keep those places active. And the bottom line is, if this is supposed to be harming the water quality going into the Grand Canyon, coming out of it, there is no scientific evidence to back that up. It just simply does not happen. Didn't happen 6 years ago when we tried this bill. It's still not happening now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Perlmutter?
Bishops, you've called these retreads, so these bills have been around for some time, correct?
Colorado one was a Polis bill originally.
No further questions?
Thank you. Ms. Lesko?
Thank you. I actually have a question. Thank you both for being here. I have a question for Mr. Gahalva. And this is, Mr. Gahalva, we're both Arizonans, and so I'm trying to find out more about the uranium mining around the Grand Canyon. And I was reading online just now, there's something regarding the national security of, and it says, the secretary found and advised me of his opinion. This is from the White House, and it was a study on imports of uranium from other countries and national security. And it says, the secretary found and advised me of his opinion that uranium is being imported into the United States in such quantities and under such circumstances as to threaten to impair the national security of the United States. Currently, the United States imports approximately 93% of its commercial uranium compared to 85.8% in 2009. The secretary found that this figure is because of increased production by foreign state-owned, blah, blah, blah. You had said, could you repeat what you said about the Department of Defense said that, what did you say, that we have a sufficient supply of uranium? Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. They have a significant reserve available to the Department of Defense that sustains whatever needs come up, whether it's usually around the issues of weapons, submarines, and other military issues and facilities, that they have enough reserves to be able to sustain that for decades to come.
And so, Mr. Bishop, I noticed that Mr. Gosar had a couple amendments in committee on this, and I'm trying to find it in front of me. But basically, it seems like he has a big concern that if we block domestic mining of uranium, that it is a national security risk. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
It's obvious. Yes, if you're not having a domestic policy, you have to rely on foreign policies. And we're doing 97% from other countries, and the bulk of that is coming from former USSR and Chinese-owned mills. So it's a no-brainer. Now, once again, this particular bill says you want to stop the uranium from this 1 million acres simply because it's impacting the water. Your state did a study on that. It's not impacting the water. So therefore, why would you want to do something that doesn't have the result that you're supposed to be doing it for in the first place?
Well, thank you, both of you. There's obviously a huge difference of opinion. I know that Representative Gosar is very passionate about this issue, and I think has an opposing bill that I co-sponsored that wants to protect mining rights of uranium in Arizona. So thank you, both of you, for being here.
Gosar would make me look tepid on this particular issue.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Mr. Raskin, are you leaving? Okay. Ms. Scanlon? Okay. Going down the line. Morelli? Okay. Shalala? You're good? Okay. All right. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? And seeing none, I would like to thank both of our witnesses.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
For being here today, and please leave anything that you have behind so that we can insert it to the record with our stenographer, and you are now dismissed.
We'll do that if you agree to come back to the committee. It's never been the same since you left us.
I would come back to the committee if you take up my bill.
Get the offset, and I'm happy to do it.
Okay. I want to welcome our next panel to testify on amendments to H.R. 823, H.R. 1373, and H.R. 2181. Mr. Tipton and Mrs. Lesko. Okay. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Cole and all the members of the committee for considering my amendments to H.R. 823, Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act. As a lifelong resident of Colorado's 3rd Congressional District, I've always appreciated the driving force behind public land management decisions. Colorado has a long-standing history of balancing the interests of a broad range of stakeholders while also taking into consideration the needs and the interests of the folks who may not be the most vocal on the issues or who were unaware of the development of this bill. For many decades, Colorado has responsibly developed natural resources on public lands, which has funded emergency services, education, and infrastructure. We've embraced a thriving outdoor economy, protected access to these lands for historical uses and for sportsmen and other recreational access. We prioritize the conservation of delicate ecosystems and habitats, protected cultural and historic sites, and defended private property and water rights. While there are certainly disagreements on the most effective ways to carry out these things, most of us agree that the best possible way to be able to work out those disagreements is by listening to local communities and those affected by the federal decisions. During my time in Congress, I've seen cases where this type of local engagement happens and cases where it does not. On Hermosa Creek and Chimney Rock in southwest Colorado, we had a fully inclusive community outreach process that occurred with many months of bipartisan work and conversations with stakeholders from all sides of the debate. This resulted in community consensus around those land management decisions and a positive outcome for all involved. Simply put, we've not seen the same type of outreach, negotiation, and local engagement with the CORE Act as a whole. This is evidenced by the phone calls my staff and I had late last week and into this weekend with county commissioners who would be impacted by the bill and have expressed issues that still need to be addressed. Some of the commissioners said that they have not had enough time to be able to do the outreach that they feel is necessary to their communities around these critically important issues. This is the same feedback I've heard from many stakeholders and elected officials in the 3rd District as we've conducted public meetings on these issues over the past few months. I applaud my colleague and the CORE Act sponsor, Mr. Neguse, for his passion to be able to protect public lands in Colorado, a passion that I personally share. I represent the district where most of my colleagues' bill would have an impact. I'd be remiss if I didn't speak out on behalf of many of my constituents who have yet to have their voices heard in this process or to be able to have their issues addressed. There is still much outreach that needs to happen and conversations and negotiations that need to take place before there will be a possibility for consensus among all the communities impacted by this bill. There are 29 counties in Colorado's 3rd District, most of which contain sizable amounts of public land. The commissioners, other local elected officials, and stakeholders in these counties have experiences, knowledge, and opinions that should be given due consideration when crafting a massive public lands bill that directly impacts many of them and indirectly impacts them all. I'm firmly committed to be giving all of these counties, not just some of them, the opportunity to be able to have their voices heard and their ideas considered in the process. The amendments I've offered today represent an ongoing process that should continue and not come to an end in a premature vote that has not been fully vetted by those who will have to live under it. These amendments are the result of the meetings and conversations that have taken place with my office across Colorado's 3rd District and pertain only to the 3rd District. The amendments I offer today would provide necessary protections for water rights, grazing rights, the critical U.S. Army high-altitude aerial training program, allow for necessary public land management activities, and release wilderness study areas that have been widely deemed as unfit for wilderness designation and yet languish under the study area designations. While I believe these amendments are necessary and should be included in the CORE Act to reflect some of the concerns that the communities in the 3rd District have expressed, they are not exhaustive, and I anticipate that as we continue to work in the district on these public lands issues, the list will grow. A vote for the CORE Act this week should be reconsidered. More outreach and more inclusive process needs to happen before a bipartisan public lands bill with local consensus will be possible. Again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak on my behalf and the behalf of constituents in my district on the amendments that the committee has before them today.
Thank you for your testimony. Mrs. Lesko?
I'm going to be offering amendment. Do you want me to do the testimony now or when I
You can do your
make it?
testimony.
Okay, all right. I'll be offering an amendment to H.R. 1373 that states that the act shall not become effective until the Secretary of the Interior, in consultation with the Secretary of Labor, finds that the withdrawal will not adversely affect jobs available to Native Americans, other minorities, and women. As noted at the markup in Natural Resources Committee, the temporary political mineral withdrawal imposed in 2012 by the Obama administration, which focused on banning mining, cost Arizona and Utah thousands of jobs and $29 billion in economic activity. I believe we should not entertain a withdrawal without confirmation that this bill will not adversely affect jobs, particularly for Native Americans, minorities, and women.
Thank you, Mrs. Lesko. Now I turn to Mr. Perlmutter for any questions that he may have.
So I'd say to my friend, Mr. Tipton, and I'd like to enter into the record the map of the lands that are designated for various things in the Core Act.
Without objection.
So I asked Mr. Bishop, if this was a retread, and he said yes, that this is the bill that Mr. Polis introduced in the past. Is that right?
That was the chairman's comment.
And did you work with Mr. Polis at all in connection with this? So you've not worked with neither Mr. Neguse nor Mr. Polis went and talked to you about this?
No, actually, Mr. Polis did not, neither did Congressman Neguse. In terms of the legislation, we became aware, we had an original bill, it's called the San Juan Wilderness Bill, which was just southern and southwest Colorado, that we'd had conversations on and participated in. We'd expressed some of the concerns on that. And so we've seen several iterations and some changes that are good, frankly.
Did you work, so I know with Senator Bennett, you worked with him on a couple of the wilderness bills that you and he co-sponsored.
Right.
Did you work with him at all on this Core Act?
Actually, we just went over last week and presented pretty much the amendments that you have before you today to Senator Bennett.
Okay. And it is true that just looking at the map, I mean, much of it is the Thompson Divide, which is something that is controversial. The environmentalists don't like what's happening there. The oil and gas guys want more of it. And you've been in the middle, and there has been this controversy and conflict, no question. But that's the biggest single piece of all of this act. And, just for me, I'm, just on the periphery of this thing. So I've heard, for 10 years, different pieces of this thing being discussed. So it isn't new to you, but it was never, no agreement was ever reached with you.
I think just to be able to give some clarification on that, in terms of some of the discussions that have gone on, we've just been we're working on a draft piece of legislation now out of our office. And we've been able to cite at each one of those roundtables. We were never included in those meetings. Had several representatives from several of the environmental groups that said that's something that does need to be addressed in terms of making awareness to the communities. That's now reflected again with the county commissioners that we're talking to and a variety of the counties in the 3rd District that would be impacted, that they weren't included in those. So while some of the conversations were going, not all were included.
I was told that the county commissioners for each of the counties that are affected by this, for the lands within their county, have agreed to the designations within their county. Am I mistaken on that?
That's inaccurate. We just had testimony from Keenan Ertel, County Commissioner out of Montezuma County, in regards to some of the wilderness study areas that are there. They're not in agreement with that. We just had conversations with
the entire
County
board
commissioners. Yes.
Okay.
And just for clarification.
All I know is I always beg for your support of every one of my bills, and I'm surprised that these other guys haven't done that.
Yeah, and I think that there's certainly some value in terms of what is there. I think the conversation does need to be able to continue, and we do need to make sure that some of the voices that have not been heard are heard. And I think that we can find, and some of the amendments that we have are to try and be able to make this bill, I think, a little more representative of some of the concerns that are there, but as I noted, they aren't exhaustive.
I think we're going to support having some of your amendments brought to the floor, but not all of them. And I guess just for me, I'm sorry that there hasn't been more discussion with you, and I will also talk to some of my colleagues about that. But on the other hand, I know that these various pieces of property that are in this have been the subject of conversation for a decade at least. You know, different kinds of, you change the boundary slightly here, you modify it slightly there. But it isn't that these are new. I mean, they have been on the books for a long time.
And I think the important thing to be able to note is they have changed. So to be able to say it's not new, but no, the dynamics at times have changed. We have one in the San Juan Wilderness to be able to allow heliskiing, which I actually support. But it was in a wilderness area, which doesn't meet the definition of it. So that was an adjustment that was made. And I think that that's some of the value of maybe being included in some of the conversations as they are ongoing, just to be able to bring that up. We just had testimony on a draft piece of legislation that we're working on down in Uray. We had a lady come in and start talking about water quality when it comes to some of the potential wilderness areas and the problems that we're now having. We see the animus. It wasn't out of a wilderness area, but the fish kill and the animus now off of a burn area. So taking those factors into consideration is something I think is going to be very important.
And I'll just end with this. I think you represent one of the most beautiful places in America. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And you, as I, Coloradans, we love that beauty and we love our open space. And over the course of the last 10 years, that desire has grown even more pronounced. So I appreciate you wanting to really help refine all of this. So I appreciate your testimony today. I appreciate Senator Bennett and Mr. Neguse and Governor Polis for really pushing this stuff to the fore, because for my constituents who take advantage of the beautiful parts of the state that you represent, I know that they like this public lands bill that is before us. And with that, I'll yield back.
Okay, I now turn to the ranking member Cole for any questions that he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of quick ones, because obviously my friend from Colorado and my other friend from Colorado know more about this than I do. I just, process-wise, Congressman Tipton, do you think you've been heard in this, or the people in your district have been heard in this sufficiently?
There's certainly been a lot of input and a lot of, but it's been in not as broad a fashion as I think that would be beneficial. When we start talking about water quality, when we're talking to, frankly, the elected officials closest to the land, our county commissioners. I can cite Montrose County, Garfield County, as an example, does not support the legislation. So we do have counties that have apparently not had their voice actually heard. And like I say, it's not unsalvageable. I think that there's an opportunity to be able to work together, to be able to identify areas, to be able to make sure that we've got that common ground to be able to work off of, and that's something that I think would be very desirable.
I know quite often things are talked about a long time, but that doesn't mean the people talking about those things are talking to one another. Sometimes that gets missed in the process, and it seems to me that that's what you're arguing for. So I certainly hope we make as many of your amendments as possible in order, preferably all of them, because it strikes me this seems to be moving a lot faster than it should be to end up with a thoughtful, balanced piece of legislation that would create consensus rather than controversy inside your district. So is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, any other member on the Democratic side wish to be recognized? No? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I find in my district, much like my classmate from Colorado, that the thing that brings us together as Republicans, Democrats, are things that are happening in our own backyard. We have a lot of transplants who move into my part of the world, and sometimes they don't share my political philosophy, but they came because of all the wonderful things that are available in the district that I represent. Your population is not a shrinking population. Yours is a growing population as folks pursue the beautiful space that you have. It is frustrating to me, Madam Chair, that we have to have 10 amendments offered in the Rules Committee by the member whose district this is. You would have thought. I mean, these are not partisan things. Let's increase the offsets for motorized trails so that they don't contaminate wilderness areas, right? That sounds like a Democratic amendment if we were going to characterize one, and yet my friend can't get that done in committee. He has to come to the Rules Committee to get that done. Let's deal with Department of Defense aircraft and the special needs that they have and the special needs that wilderness areas have. Again, this isn't a rabid right-wing amendment. This is something that comes in the area of common sense and both preservation and national security. The tale that my constituents see back home from this town, Mr. Tipton, is that it's an us against them battle up here, because it seems like we go out of our way sometimes to present bills that are that. I didn't understand exactly what your answer was to Mr. Cole's question. These are thoughtful amendments. These are ideas, I suspect, like so many that I have, that aren't your ideas. They've come up from your constituents who've said, hey, Congressman, can you help with this? Can you fix that? Let me tell you about my experience and how to make things better. If your amendments were made in order, and again, it looks like lots of common sense bipartisan work here, would you expect to be able to win the support of the Colorado delegation on the Colorado bill, or is the bill so flawed in its underlying construction that even with your amendments added, it might not win the support of your Colorado colleagues?
Well, and I appreciate that. It's pretty much my view that there's still work to be done on the bill. We have several late entrants, and it was simply because of a lack of awareness of the activity that was going on the legislation that are now bringing forward concerns that they have on it. And these are people that love, as Congressman Perlmutter was noting, love where we live and want to be able to protect it. And so with, I think, some work down the road, we can get to a common ground to be able to get broad support, complete support out of our congressional delegation, but there's still work to be done, and this was a starting point, and as I say, it is not exhaustive.
These are not gotcha amendments. I don't think any fair-minded person on either side of the aisle would characterize your amendments as gotcha amendments. They are. Let me say again, Mr. Tipton, there's a lot of partnership in here, Mr. Perlmutter. As you know, my question is, because it's a narrowly tailored bill, because the expertise does live in the Colorado delegation, so many of the advocates that we have here, do you see a pathway for mischievousness? You and I were a part of some of the last open rules this Congress ever had back when we got here in 2011. Would it trouble you, since this is your district, well, 65% of it's your district, if we passed an open rule so that all members could have their concerns heard about this legislation? Or do you see a pathway that would cause more harm than good to the constituents that you represent?
I actually think, if we have an open rule, it's not a bad thing for members to be able to express their concerns, because, interestingly, I think one thing we all discover is when you get here, it may not be your district, but your vote will impact other areas. And so having that understanding in the good heart, through the Rocky Mountain region, we have a lot of commonality with a lot of the public lands. The vast majority of the public lands in the United States are in that Rocky Mountain region. So to be able to have an open rule and to be able to have people to have a voice, that's what we're elected to do. And so I wouldn't have a problem with it.
Well, my take-home message from this hearing, Mr. Tipton, is that Mr. Perlmutter's constituents leave his district and come to your district to spend time and money because of the good job you've done representing those people there, and I appreciate it. Fair enough. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mrs. Lesko, do you have any questions for Mr. Tipton? Okay, does any other member of the committee wish to seek recognition? Mr. Perlmutter?
Introduce into the record all sorts of letters of support from the counties, the cities in this area affected by it.
Okay, without objection? Yes, Mr. Cole.
We just received the Statement of Administration Policy on HR 23 and HR 1373, both of which would advise the President advisors would recommend a veto. So I'd like to enter these into the record if I may.
Without objection. Any other members seek recognition? Seeing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Please leave anything behind that you would like inserted into the record. And you are now dismissed.
Thank you.
Are there any other members who wish to testify on HR 823, HR 1373, HR 2181? Seeing none, this closes the hearing on those three measures. I would like now to call up our next panel to testify on House Resolution 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide. Chairman Engel and Mr. Smith, we are delighted to have you here today. Anything that you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered to the record. And I will now recognize gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. The resolution before us is an important measure to set the record straight on the atrocities suffered by the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. We know what happened in this dark period of history. Between 1915 and 1923, 1.5 million Armenians were murdered. That's 1.5 million. This was a genocide, and it's important that we call this crime what it was. Many American elected officials, diplomats, and institutions have rightly recognized these atrocities as a genocide, including America's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Henry Morgenthau, and later, President Ronald Reagan. It's time that we set the record straight. Only by shining a light on the darkest parts of our history can we learn to not repeat them. And properly acknowledging what has occurred is a necessary step in achieving some measure of justice for the victims. House Resolution 296 sticks to the historical facts. It is a good, common-sense measure with broad bipartisan support. I want to thank Mr. Schiff, the resolution's author, as well as Chairman McGovern, Ms. Eshu, Ms. Spire, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Smith, and the other bipartisan champions of this issue for their persistent, steadfast pursuit of recognition for the suffering the Armenian people endured. I strongly support advancing this resolution to consideration by the full House. By doing so, we put Congress on the right side of history, properly acknowledging and condemning this horrific genocide. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony, and I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let me associate my remarks with Chairman Engel. I think he made it very clear what we're talking about. This resolution has been around for over 2 decades. Twice it almost came to the floor in the year 2000 and again in the year 2007. Mr. Rovdanovich was the prime sponsor back in 2000. It was a bipartisan. David Bonner was the co-sponsor, and now it's flipped, and of course there's a Democrat and Republican lead on it this time. I've chaired 2 congressional hearings on the Armenian genocide in the year 2000. I had a very, very long hearing. We heard from scholars, the State Department. We heard from the authors of the resolution at the time. And I have to tell you, in preparation for it, I went and read Morgenthau's book. He was our ambassador during the time of the genocide. He was our ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And it was a very persuasive case the term had not yet been coined, genocide, but it was a genocide. The willful, massive destruction of a people. The Genocide Convention, of course, says the destruction in whole or in part. The attempt here was the whole of the Armenian people. About 1.5 million people were slaughtered, as Chairman Elliot Engel just said a moment ago. About 500,000 were put to flight, exiled forcibly, and it is one of the worst things. When Adolf Hitler was contemplating his cruelty and atrocities, he said, "Who remembers the Armenians?" Raphael Lemkin, when he coined the actual phrase of genocide, he said, "It's like what the Germans did to the Jews, and it's what the Turks did to the Armenians." This resolution is a long time in coming. It's never a good time. I remember when the legislation was coming up in the House, Sandy Berger, then the National Security Advisor, admonished our speaker then to not bring it to the floor. It was all ready to go, and it never had its vote. And that would have been, of course, Dennis Hastert that pulled the bill. Ditto again in 2007. This time it was the Bush administration that didn't want it to come to the floor, and it didn't. There's never a good time with Turkey to take this up. Maybe this isn't the best, who knows? But it's never a good time, and they get away. They have a very well-financed lobby effort, both on Capitol Hill and elsewhere, that they employ to try to diminish the possibility. They try to just say this was just part of war. No, it wasn't. This was a deliberate attempt to eviscerate the Armenians from the face of the earth. And finally, my hope is that this resolution will pass. It is sent to the Congress, but it would put the House on record. 49 states, including just about everybody here at the table, and 28 countries have recognized the Armenian genocide. It's about time we did so as well.
Thank you for your testimony. I now turn to Mr. Perlmutter for any questions. We're going to committee questions first.
I worry about the Kurds.
Thank you. I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any questions that he may have.
Just a couple questions, and I think you probably both answered them, but I just want to get them on the record. Obviously, this in this particular case, this piece of legislation is coming without a hearing this time around. I just want to, do you think that was necessary in any way or advisable? Would the hearing have been a useful thing to have had? Mr. Chairman, I'll ask you first, and I'd ask the ranking member.
Well, we didn't think that the hearing was necessary, Mr. Cole, because we, in previous years, have had hearings on this issue, and I think it's pretty straightforward in that we all know what happened and really what was done. I think that this is an important time to do it, given what's happening now with in the Middle East, involving Turkey, quite frankly, and I think that for many, many years, many of us, if not all of us, have had our constituents come to see us to talk about the genocide. And so we thought that this was the right time for a number of reasons to offer it and to this time have it on the House floor. It's been very frustrating for me and for others that we would pass it out of the Foreign Affairs Committee and it would be held up and never brought to a vote on the floor from leadership in this Congress, a Democratic and Republican alike. Yeah. Now we have the opportunity to do it. I think that based on what's happening around the world, people are more aware of it. And frankly, we're stating facts. We're not making things up. We're stating facts. So we thought that a hearing wasn't necessary. Everybody knows what happened. Everybody has a position on it. And so we didn't want to do anything that would delay it even further. Thank you.
I think hearings are always helpful. We've had 4 total. I've chaired 2 of them. The one by Tom Lantos, the most in 2007, was very eye-opening, as they all were. We always get some additional perspective. The one in 2015 that I chaired, the second one, was all about a century of denial by the Turks. It is, and I've met with Turkish leaders frequently on this issue, and I am, unlike the Nazi, or the Germans after World War II, who came clean and admitted to the Holocaust and what had happened, and actually looked for reconciliation to some extent. That hasn't happened. And even the Pope made the point, the current Pope, Francis, that it's like a sore that doesn't ever heal if you get this denial campaign that is so aggressively pushed. So I do believe, and it is a denial. I mean, they threaten other countries. They threaten us. When I had the hearing in 2000, the ambassador from Turkey, because I had both sides at the table, the Armenians and the Turks, he threatened us with Incirlik. Frankly, with a friend like that in NATO, who needs enemies? Why can't they accept this for what it is? They massively slaughtered so many people. They raped the women as a matter of warfare, of genocide. And so I think they have to come clean. And I think if our country does this, if the European Union can do it, half of the EU countries can do it. If the Vatican can do it, why can't we? But I think a hearing is always helpful. Since this sense of the Congress does not, the way previous ones have said, calls on the president to very specifically have it in his annual, it talks about what we should say, but I think the other ones were more specific, so the administration might be more probable to opine on what their view is on the previous resolutions. This puts the House on record, and that's a good thing, to say that this genocide occurred, and we need to recognize it, and for the memories of those who died and the survivors. I have a few in my district that I've met with. We have in Brookdale Community College, there's a Holocaust and genocide memorial there, and it's unbelievable testimonies from people, including a number of Armenians. And I've gone to it, I've talked to people there. That's at Brookdale Community College in Monmouth County. So a hearing would have been good, but it's still, the record is clear on this.
Okay, one additional question. Obviously, in a variety of ways, and I think you both mentioned this in your testimony, we've been on record numerous times recognizing that this happened. Maybe not the United States House, but the United States government has. And to my friend, Mr. Smith, as he said, there's never a good time probably, because this always has consequences to it. But so you really feel strongly this is the right time, that this is a time that would make some sort of consequential difference, because there will be fallout, obviously, for this. There always is.
It's going to always.
I think this time is as good as any. I think that if we don't move this bill 10 years from now, the Congress will still be arguing it 20 years from now. You know, this isn't something that we're alone. I have a whole list of countries and groups that have supported it. And if I can find it, I'd like to mention it, because I think it's important. Thank you. Okay, well, we have many of our NATO allies have recognized it officially as a genocide, or have government bodies that have recognized the genocide, including France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Poland, Greece, the Netherlands, the UK, Spain, Belgium, Lithuania, Portugal, and others. Mentioned before, 49 out of 50 U.S. states have officially recognized the genocide. We've got to get after Mississippi to join the the other 49 states. Overall, the majority of Europe and almost the entire Western Hemisphere has recognized it as a genocide. Resolutions endorsed by the Anti-Defamation League, the Armenian National Committee of America, ANCA, the Armenian Assembly of America, in Defense of Christians, A Demand for Action, Hellenic American Leadership Council, American Hellenic Institute, and American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association, the American Jewish Committee, and the National Council of Churches. So it's been around, and we all know what it says and does, and I think it's an important time to do this. And I think waiting any further would just keep doing what we've been doing for the past 20-some-odd years, and I think that's not helpful. I think this is the right time.
Mr. Smith?
Again, I think, as I said earlier, there's no best time for this. It was argued in 2007. No-fly zones, concerns about the situation that's adjacent to Turkey. where we needed access. But this is a historical fact, and that's what I found so.
You did mention there was something different, and I just want
Yes,
to ask this
yeah.
for clarification compared to what's been done previously. Could you just
Well,
point that
annually, the
out?
president puts out a statement, no matter who's in the White House. And frankly, all of the presidents have made strong statements about massacres, forced deportations, but they are unwilling to cross the line and call it what it is, a genocide, because the Turks have made that the non-negotiable. And it seems to me that, a genocide, when you don't call it that, we had the same problem when people were unwilling to call what was happening in Darfur, a genocide, the systematic elimination of people living in South Sudan, in Sudan, I should say. It matters, words do matter, and genocide is its own horrific crime in the lexicon of crimes, and it's the worst of the worst, and the Turks get that, which is why they've drawn a red line and said, you can't call it that. They want to just dismiss it, that somehow it was a firefight between the Armenians and the Turks, and it was not. It was a one-way slaughter. They rounded people up, they marched them in long death marches, very often bayoneting and killing, and raping women along the route in this attempt to, again, get rid of a group of people, an entire ethnicity that they found deplorable. And I think it's awful. But the difference between this one and previous ones, it calls for commemorates the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance. Previous sense of the Congresses went right to the heart of the president and what he says. Maybe it was done to try to just get the House on record and say clearly and unambiguously, this is a genocide. And I think that's good.
Right.
That's a good step for us to take.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anybody, Ms. Scanlon?
Yes, next to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, there's a 22-foot tall statue commemorating the Armenian genocide. That was dedicated in '76. The Philadelphia Historical Society has reams of materials on this historical fact. I've heard from so many constituents about this. They clearly think that now is too late. We should have done this before, so I look forward to voting for this. Thank you.
Anybody on this side? Mr. Woodall?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to find out, the chairman said he wants that we need to set the record straight, and if all other nations can do it, we should be able to do it. The ranking member said we need to put the House on record. My question isn't, is now the right time? My question is, why wasn't it the right time when we did put the House on record in '75, when the president did put America on record in '81, when the House again went on record in '84? When is this going to be something that to accomplish, and I trust that our two witnesses as much as I trust anyone in this institution on issues of foreign affairs, is this something that we need to do every year to put the House on record? When are we going to have the record set straight? When are we going to have acknowledged the facts? And then when will we move on in partnership with both our Armenian friends and our Turkish friends? Mr. Chairman?
Yes, you raised some important points. First of all, the frustration in previous years, since I've been here, which is 30 years, we would pass a resolution in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it would be held up, and we could never get it to the floor, under both Democrats and Republicans. Many of us are concerned about what's going on in various parts of the world. The Armenian genocide was a genocide, and many of us are concerned with, frankly, genocide against others like the Kurds. It's happening right now, and Turkey is again in the thick of things. So I think if there was never a right time to release this before, now is certainly the right time with what's going on in Syria and Turkey and that region of the world. It's one thing to commemorate a Holocaust or genocide, but it's another thing to call it out so that these things will never happen again, And if they are happening, we're showing that the world is not going to sweep it under the rug again. So I think that this has an added, given what's happening in that part of the world now, I think that this has an added importance to it. And I'm not going to, pretend or deny and say, well, everything is separate. No, I've always supported this bill. I support it especially now because of what's going on in the region of the world where Turkey is. Years ago, when I visited Turkey and met with with Erdogan, who is now the leader of Turkey, and his minister, they were very, very thin-skinned about the Armenian genocide. They asked me, that was the question they asked me. You're on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Of course, I wasn't chairman then, but you're on the Foreign Affairs Committee and you voted for the genocide. And they gave me, I'll never forget, 2 shopping bags full of books, which they were in Turkish, so I couldn't read them anyway. 4 books on one shopping bag and 4 in the other. And it went on and on and on, I guess, about their historical perspective of the Armenian genocide. I still don't know what was in it. And I thought, what was that play in Shakespeare? Methink the lady doth protest too much. I think the Turks protest too much. Turkish leadership protests too much because they know what we know, what Mr. Smith said, what Ms. Escher has said for many years. This was a genocide, clear and simple. And I'll be very proud when we pass it and follow the countries that are our allies that I mentioned before, and many of the EU countries who have done it. It's time that we acknowledge it. And I think this is not only the time to do it, it's the absolute right time to do it.
Mr. Smith, you said it is bewildering in a way why the Turkish government in Ankara is so unwilling to recognize the fact. When I had that hearing in 2000, or chaired it, I should say, the Turkish ambassador who testified was just spinning lies and deception the entire time about what happened. We had scholars there as well who were correcting the record, and I'm glad they were there to provide that insight. So this disinformation campaign, aided and abetted by many lobbyists, some of our members, former members, who have gone into lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government, have been able to frustrate these efforts. And if you look at all the statements by the presidents over the years, they're strong statements. I mean, George Bush said this is about forced exile and then the annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians. The Armenian government can live with that because it doesn't cross that important line of saying it was a genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire. People like President Obama, when he was a senator, was a co-sponsor of the resolution, promised he would bring it up. 8 years later, it still he had not uttered those words of genocide. And the same could be said about the other on the Republican side as well. We did pass legislation in the mid-90s in an appropriations bill that talked about the survivors of the Armenian genocide, but it didn't have the clarity, didn't have the visibility, and I say again, did not have the clarity of what this resolution, with its whereas clauses and the 3 clauses have. We want to be very clear. And then what happens every year when the president issues his statement, our statement in the future, there's always good, strong language. Now we would fully expect that it include the word genocide. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to look them in the eyes, they being in Ankara, and say, we're not kidding. Our allies, as has been said, Germany and other nations in the EU have done it, as have others throughout the world. Why can't we? Getting back to Tom Cole, there's never a good time. This may not be a good time, but there's never a good time. But we need to speak truth to power.
And if that is our goal, speaking truth to power, setting the record straight, properly acknowledging it, recognizing the chairman's frustration of 20 years, 30 years of resolutions that have not come to the floor, this is just a House resolution. This will not go to the United States Senate. This will not go to the President of the United States. So if this passes the House this week, have we done all of those things, spoken truth to power, set the record straight, acknowledged the facts, and thus we won't have another 30 years of members frustrated? Or is it your view that we need to do this each and every year until you get a recognition from the Turkish government that our facts are right and their story is wrong?
If I could, we could. But I think it's, the ball will clearly rest with the president and with the Senate to do likewise. But again, through Democrat and Republican administrations, even when promises were made, there were promises were not kept, including President Obama, who couldn't make clear. I remember when he made the statement, I said, at least that'll get done, in terms of this human rights agenda, and it didn't. And in 2015, as we had the 100th year of the beginning of this genocide, those who testified, and they were the prominent members of the Armenian community, were very, very frustrated that that had not happened. So this, again, asserts we can only do what we can do. My hope is that the others will say it is time. It's about time.
One final question. I actually quipped to my friend Dr. Burgess when we first began talking about Turkey and its conduct again, that knowing how these resolutions always get stalled, that this just may well be the time to bring up the Armenian genocide resolution. Lo and behold, here it is on the desk. But to Mr. Perlmutter's point, to the chairman's point, we all worry about the Kurds. Is it the committee's view that this absolves us of those concerns? It absolutely sets the record straight about Armenia, but I'm still going to have the same concerns about the Kurds the day after this resolution is heard that I have the day before the resolution is heard. Are we also going to come back with a resolution that's equally forceful, that's equally demanding to protect our friends?
Yeah, we did. But there's also going to be a sanctions bill on the floor in response to Turkey's mistreatment of the Kurds that's coming up under suspension this week.
Okay.
So,
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman?
the chairman points out quite rightly that we're going to have a punitive bill about Turkey's actions, and it is coming up this week. I remember when one of my predecessors as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Lantos, got up in frustration because each time we were promised that the bill would move through, and each time the Turks in Ankara pushed it back. I think that this is the right time, and I don't think, well, we know that a resolution isn't an end-all and be-all. It shows the world that we haven't forgotten those people, and in this very perilous time, we're not going to sit idly by and allow genocide to happen anywhere in the world. And there are other instances in the world. Mr. McGovern and I and others have worked on Rohingya people. It's important, I think, that we do this now, and we'll see what the future holds. But I'll be very, very proud of this body when we pass the resolution.
I thank the chairman. I yield back.
let me just say, too, we can't control what Turkey says or whether Turkey will ever admit to this genocide. What we can control is what we say and what we do. And the fact that the United States of America, like the greatest, most powerful country in the world, has been reluctant and afraid to acknowledge a historical fact that a genocide occurred against Armenian people really is a stain on our human rights record. That's right. And if we're willing to, play along with Turkey to whitewash an awful chapter of their history, then that is noticed by others, but dictators and tyrants around the world when they decide to take action against civilians that maybe would just wait them out. They'll forget all about it. So this to me is. The question is not whether we should do this. The question is why the hell haven't we done it? Any other questions on this side? Mr. Morelli.
No question. I just want to thank the chair, the ranking member, Ms. Eshu. I did just want to note in 2002 and in 2008, I had the chance to vote for this in the New York State legislature, and as majority leader in 2015, we similarly passed a resolution on the 100th anniversary of the genocide. So this is something I think is high time for the House of Representatives, and I thank all of you for being here today.
Well, being an alumnus of the New York State Assembly with my colleague here, I'd say good for the Assembly.
Ms. Lesko.
Yes, I don't have a question. I just want to say I'm one of the original co-sponsors, and so I thank you for bringing this forward. I'll be supporting it.
Thank you.
That's
Ms. Shalala.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a couple things to say. My grandparents left the Ottoman Empire because of what they were doing. They were Maronites. They were caught up in the Armenian genocide. I grew up in a neighborhood with Armenians and Chaldeans and Maronites and Melkites, and my grandmother would weep when she talked about what had happened to her Armenian friends, but also to the Maronites in the Ottoman Empire. So I am proud to vote for this resolution, and I vote for all four of my grandparents who left the Ottoman Empire. They were lucky, but their friends and neighbors were not.
Mr. Saunier, okay. No further questions, so Mr. Smith and Mr. Engel, thank you very much. You are dismissed, and now we
Thank you.
go to our final panel, Ms. Eshu of California, who's been a long-time supporter of this resolution, and we are grateful that she is here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Cole, and all of the members of the Rules Committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify on HRES 296 today. I don't come up to the Rules Committee very often, but anytime I have, I've always felt very welcome here. I'm here obviously in support of the bipartisan resolution. I think our two colleagues that just spoke really spoke eloquently and answered the many questions that you posed. I may be repeating some things, but I think that they're worth repeating. The resolution commemorates the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance by the House of Representatives. That's an important phrase. We've been waiting for this for a long time. It rejects efforts to deny the existence of the genocide, and very importantly, it encourages education and public understanding of the genocide and efforts that were made at one time by the United States to provide humanitarian relief. And both the chairman and the ranking member spoke to that and called out some of our very courageous officials of decades ago that were key in those efforts. Frankly, I've been waiting for this moment since I first entered Congress 27 years ago. I've co-sponsored the resolution in every Congress, and now working hard to bring this to the floor. Actually, I kind of rang the bell and went to the Speaker, to the Majority Leader, to Mr. McGovern, two members of the superb bipartisan Armenian American caucus and organizations to say, you know what, I think now is the time. You all know that between 1915 and 1923, there were 1.5 million Armenians and hundreds of thousands. And this is not very well known. Congresswoman Shalala just filled out the record with who she called out. There were hundreds of thousands of Assyrians, Greeks, Syriacs, Aramaeans, Maronites, and other Christians that were systematically slaughtered at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Not by modern-day Turkey, by the Ottoman Empire. Some of you know that members of my own family were amongst those that were murdered, and my parents fled with theirs to America. My father always used to say, this word, America, is the best idea that was ever born. But they lived all of their lives remembering that terror, both my grandparents and my parents. And of course, I know the stories very well. I'm a first-generation American. I'm the only member of Congress that is of Armenian and Assyrian descent. So both sides were persecuted. And I thank Congresswoman Shalala for saying what she said. So this resolution obviously doesn't just honor those that were lost in my family, but it commemorates all those who perished in that horror, who were lost in the first genocide of the 20th century. I have listened and read full-page ads in the Washington Post over the years, Democratic and Republican administrations, and they all read, now is not the time. I think it is, as the chairman said, kind of a stain on the reputation of the United States of America that, that we have not spoken out and officially recognized the genocide. 49 states in our country have recognized it. 29 countries, including 14 NATO allies, have recognized the genocide. So I think it's time for the Congress to act. I think 100 years of silence is enough. Sadly, Turkey denies that the Armenian genocide ever took place, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. As an ancestor of those that were lost, I'm here as a seated fact to testify to it. So I urge the committee to favorably report this resolution. I believe that there is the reason why I pushed hard now is because I believe that there is a historic parallel today, because Turkey is once again engaging in those two words that scholars and journalists are repeating over and over again: ethnic cleansing against the Kurds in Syria. So I think the time has come, and I thank you again for allowing me to testify today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for ringing the bell and getting us all focused on this issue, because I think it is timely. You know, I represent one of the oldest Armenian communities in the country, Worcester, Massachusetts, the first Armenian church. And when I first got elected, I remember in 1997, when I would go to the commemorations at the church, you know, the first several pews were filled with survivors. The last survivor in my area died in 2015, a woman named Rose. And, you know, and I thought, you know, I show up every year, and they would talk about the genocide, they would talk about the horrific things that happened. And it wasn't easy for these individuals. And in fact, it was very, very painful, especially as they got older and older. They came to this country, they loved this country. They, you know, they revered our commitment to human rights, and were always very disappointed that we never ever rose to the occasion and actually acknowledged the genocide for what it was, and that is a genocide. And so I look at this for all those. I wish I could turn the clock back, and all those, you know, survivors who were there could see what we're doing now. We can't do that. So it's their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids that we're going to do this for, and also for our own moral standing in the world. I mean, this shouldn't be difficult by any measure. I mean, we should be able to speak truth, and we ought to adhere to historical accuracy. Any questions on this side? On this side, Mr. Cole, Mr. We thank you so much for being here and for your advocacy.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Thank you, Todd.
Are there any other members who wish to testify on H-Res 296? Seeing none, that closes the hearing portion of our meeting. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Ms. Shalala. Yes, Ms. Shalala. Yeah.
I move the committee grant H.R. 823, the Colorado Outdoor Recreation and Economy Act structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of travel today, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources, now printed in the bill, as modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order not only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 1373, the Grand Canyon Centennial Protection Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes in order as original text for the purpose of amendment, the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources, now printed in the bill, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part C of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 2181, the Chaco Cultural Heritage Area Protection Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part D of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part E of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against amendments printed in Part E of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 4 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from November 1st, 2019 through September 11th, 2019, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at that date, and a time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. The rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed in Section 4. The rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 4 shall not constitute a calendar or a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7C1 of Rule 22. Finally, the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 4 shall not constitute a legislative day for the purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 15.
Thank you very much. And just to summarize, on the Colorado outdoor bill, there are 6 amendments made in order. There are 2 Democratic amendments and 4 Republican amendments. For the Grand Canyon bill, we plan to make in order 3 amendments. All of them are Republican amendments. On the Chaco Heritage bill, 4 amendments in order, 1 Democratic amendment, and 3 Republican amendments. So you've heard the motion from the gentleman from Florida. Is there any amendment or discussion? Mr. Cole.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to compliment you on making so many amendments in order here. I think this committee has done a very good job on this bill and opening up. Our big concern has been the inability of a lot of members to have a chance to participate in something that's important to them. So we are going to submit 1 amendment only, which is just for an open rule. But that's really just designed to make sure that the process is more open in case there's somebody we missed. But again, I think this committee went above and beyond. I want to personally thank you for that.
Appreciate that.
So I would move for an open rule, however, on these three. And then full disclosure, I mean, there's one of these bills for certain I'm going to support. So, this was a good job by the Rules Committee.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much, and you heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the... Well, the vote...
You can go back and pull the Republican amendments.
Vote is...
Feel more like your
The
normal
vote is on the
practice.
Cole Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion chair, the noes have it.
Roll call.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, no. Miss Scanlon, Miss Scanlon, Miss Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, no. Miss Shalala, Miss Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
Members not agreed to any other amendments. Hearing none, the vote is now on the motion from the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Shalala. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and Ms. Shalala will manage it for the majority. No. Oh, no, the clerk report the total. Oh, I didn't call the roll?
No. This is on, yeah, we would. We'd like a roll call.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You said all those praises.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter, Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Raskin, aye. Miss Scanlon, Miss Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli, Mr. Morelli, aye. Miss Shalala, Miss Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier, Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole,
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall, Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess, Mrs. Lesko, Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will now report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
Members agreed to, and Ms. Shalala will manage it for the majority.
And Ms. Lesko for the Republicans.
And I now want to, at this time, entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Ms. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H. Res. 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Finally, the rule provides that the resolution shall be considered as read.
You heard the motion from the gentlewoman. Is there any amendment or discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Torres motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and I will handle it for the majority.
And Mr. Burgess will handle it for Republicans.
Good. There's no other business. I appreciate everybody being here, and the Rules Committee is adjourned.